I gotta admit, it's kinda sad. Today's gonna be our last visit to Wales, guys. I really wish we could have spent a little bit more time here, but I'm pretty sure we've nailed the main things, and it's just been a blast trying to recreate Wales in city skylines. We are currently at episode 34 of Europe in Detail, and let's zoom straight in here and get to detailing. This is a little Welsh style village I built in the first episode of us visiting Wales, and I've left it undetailed for long enough. It's time to come back in and finish this off. And as you guys can see, one of the more striking features of this little village here is these round or hooping roads. This is the type of layout that I noticed on Google Earth that sort of reoccurred a lot in many places in Wales. And in terms of the detailing here, it's pretty similar to what I've already done in the UK. We've got some nice brick fences around some of these properties. Some of them are like wrought iron fences, some of them are a combination of the two. Some of these backyards are really well kept, and I've also tried to add a little pocket of commercial right on the corner as we come off the bridge. I want to move back over to our little UK village and start working on something that I probably should have done in episode 1. Or actually, I did do it in episode 1, but if you guys watched that episode, you'll remember that I absolutely hated it. It was too perfect. So let's come back and do that properly. And as it turns out, properly is much more simple than how I had done it originally anyway. I'd done it originally with keys, but now I'm just using procedural objects with Mesto's seawall block and making this sort of retaining wall look like it's made out of, blocks basically. They don't line up perfectly, some of them have been moved maybe over the years, and this is the look we're going for. We don't want this too perfect. And I guess too, most of the towns I've built so far in this series have had sort of a point of difference, each one of them with a different one, and maybe this wall here is the point of difference for this little UK village. So installing that big seawall has opened up quite a bit of land here, buildable land, and what I've done here is run a couple of roads in, and I've tried to split the level of the terrain here as well, just to make it a bit more interesting. The roads are kept fairly simple. We've got one running right up to the apex of the hill and then looping back on itself, and we've got another one here that runs in and close to the top of our seawall, just to a dead end for now. And next of course comes placing the buildings down, and if you can see my demand bars, I've got a huge demand for offices and for commercial areas in general. So the first buildings I'm going to place in here close to this corner are going to be commercial. I'm also going to be a little bit crafty in a couple of places and hide some office cube services within some commercial buildings. The office cubes in particular are very user friendly. They don't create much noise, they don't create pollution. You can put them just about anywhere, and this is a good little wee hack to create really densely populated or high traffic areas, which is definitely what we're going for here. And one of the reasons why I think it's going to be high traffic is because the top of our seawall here is going to be turned into a pedestrian path or a walkway here. It seems so appropriate, and that sort of flows into that commercial area that we just built. So hopefully we can get a lot of citizens going for a lovely stroll across the top of the seawall at sunset, and then just going into the commercial area for a bite to eat. The top part of this hill here is pretty steep, and I had to use node controller on the road here to get these angles a bit more appropriate. I think I just sloped most of these intersections here. Then I need to put another road in here because there's quite a bit of free room in behind these buildings. And I'd like to stack as many buildings as I can in this area up the slope leading to the top of the hill, because we've got something pretty special later on going in on the top of that hill. And I picture a lot of buildings scattered up the hillside leading up to it. This part of our UK village is still very much part of the old town here. So that means some of the roads here, or some of the buildings rather, are going to be placed quite erratically, and maybe we could imagine the handful of residential buildings I'm putting in this area are the houses where the very first fishermen in the village or their families lived, and they built that seawall in order to protect their homes maybe. So you would imagine some of those homes would be the first in the village. So with all of that in mind, for the rest of the area here, I want to stick with the oldest type buildings that I've got in my little steam workshop collection here. So I'm looking for old or aged brick buildings with like foliage growing on them, and I'm also trying to avoid anything that looks too new, too straight, too clean, and just too modern. I figured it would be quite difficult to build on this hillside, and maybe modern techniques would mean they wouldn't build some of these places here, but back when it was appropriate to sort of jam everything in as close as you can to where you go to work, this would make sense only if these buildings showed the appropriate age of the area. So as we move in a bit closer here and start detailing, I want to start with the double yellow lines on the edge of the road. We're also going for that imperfection is perfection theme that we've had while we've been in the UK here. And once I've applied that to most of the roads here, the next thing I want to do is add a bit of variation to some of these building frontages here. We've got a lot of residential housing along here, and I want to add like little gardens and little wee walls and stairways at the front of these properties, just to add a little bit of that variation. You can also see here that I've pulled some of these buildings back from the road frontage by design so that I can create an area here for socializing areas, so things like pubs with seating areas on the road front, which is what we do here. I use some of these usable tables that real citizens are going to come and sit at. Then I'll add some bollards up the road and add some detail to all of these shop fronts to look a little bit more realistic. So that shot was a good example of the detail that I'm going to apply to the rest of the area here. I try and stick with the sort of 101 things, so things like rubbish bins and little wee gardens, but I also want to stick with that variation that I've been mentioning during the episode, because I think it's vital to add that realistic touch to our little village. Quite bizarre, but I haven't built a church in the town yet, which is a bit crazy really considering how many there is in the UK. And I figured the top of this hill here would be a pretty appropriate spot for our first one. This church again would have been one of the first buildings built in the town and would have served as a place of worship for the fishermen in the town and their families. The church here really speaks for itself. This is one of the workshop, and I don't really have to do too much. I do a little bit of landscaping around it, but this is a really beautiful asset. I love how it looks aged right out of the box. So with that church all set in place now, you can see here from the end of the lower road up to the church, I thought this was a pretty good place to put like an old broken stone walkway. And with this walkway, I really want to make it look like maybe it's as old as the church, and being this close to the beach, it's going to show some pretty serious signs of damage. So we've got some of the handrails falling apart, fallen over. heaps of grass and stuff like that overgrowing parts of it, and just general coastal wear and tear. I find that adding these sort of realistic touches that I guess they really don't have too much to do with the city in terms of it working or, being a necessity to a city, but I feel like they really add character. And to me, a city is more than just the layout, it's more than just this road leading to that road and that service being accessible to this part of the town or whatever. It's really about how much character can a neighborhood add, how much character does a village have. And for me, it's these imperfect areas that absolutely 100% add to that vibe. And I picture the opposite of that as your classic dystopian nightmare where there's just block after block after block of exactly the same house on exactly the same street. Like, that is just an absolute nightmare as far as I'm concerned. There's absolutely no human expression in that whatsoever. And maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's that, that human touch, for better or worse, that really makes areas and cities beautiful. Well, it certainly sounds good, so that's what I'm going to go for here. Getting back into some detailing here, the front of the church is pretty simple, but I do change it from what you see me put down initially here. I started with a wrought iron fence, and it just all got a little bit too fancy from there, so eventually you'll see me swap this out for some more conventional stuff. And I guess the reasoning behind that is, this isn't a big church in the middle of London. This isn't a big fancy sort of a, beautiful decals out the front. This is very much more a country style church. So for instance, rather than the wrought iron fences, I changed them for a more rugged timber fence that's just a bit more appropriate. And this is a good example of how I've developed these objectional skills playing this game. If something doesn't look right, even if you've spent hours detailing it, you've got to go with your gut feeling, and it really does mean being objective to your own work. So if you guys can see this shot, that wrought iron fence does not look right here at all, and changing it to a timber one straight away, just much more appropriate. And being able to evaluate your own work and say, I did that wrong or I could improve on that, I think is the key to getting better. This church these days may be an attraction in the village, so for that reason I've decided to put a little car park in here. I bloody hate these things, but I also realise they are a necessity, especially around these maybe ancient attractions, that are bringing tourists into the village now. So I've put this one here up the top of our walkway we made earlier, and now I just want to make it look a little bit more realistic, mainly with some decals. Then I had a thought, maybe I could add an old cemetery in here, like with props or whatever, but then add some cube services in to make it an actual cemetery area within our game. The cemetery around the church made so much sense. I was already going to do something like that, so I just decided to use a little bit of a paddock next to it to extend that cemetery out a bit. And I have to admit that while I was building this, I had a picture of a rural UK style cemetery up on my other monitor, so I wanted to get this bang on. That's the reason I did that. I do have a tendency to put down far more props than are required sometimes, and having that real life picture there as a reference just basically keeps me in check. And that cemetery turns out really nice. I got some nice shots of that later. So the next thing we move on to is, while I was doing the cemetery, I kinda got inspired to do some work with services, in particular our waste management area. It is not flash at all at the moment, and I was thinking for ages what would be here. It wouldn't be a full-on dump because I don't think the population would support having a full-on, rubbish dump. So I figured it would be sort of like a waste management or waste transfer station here. So maybe the local trucks come here and it gets transferred to other trucks that take it out of town, or maybe even the citizens can come here with their car with just some rubbish in the boot and drop it off here or whatever. But I am going to pour some pretty seriously detailed love into this horrible area that would normally sort of just go with nothing really. I can definitely safely say I have never detailed a rubbish dump before in this game. But there's a first for everything, right? So without further ado, let's get into doing this. We have a lot of these waste transfer stations where I'm from, so I have a fairly good idea on how to build this. And to explain it, I'll break it down into its most basic elements. But basically, we want a pit that catches the rubbish from people that drop it off, that's about 1 meter to 1.5 meters below ground level. And then we want another road or access point that comes in another 2 meters below that for the trucks, so that everything can be loaded appropriately. So if you imagine that the rubbish from a car or a private citizen turning up, for instance, goes into that first pit 1 meter underground, that gets pushed along to the end of the pit and then directly loaded into the back of the trucks that take it out of town. And as it stands right now, what you guys are looking at, I've completed that part of it, which is pretty easy when you break it down into those sorts of elements. Everything else I'm adding here is just an extra to try and make it a little bit more realistic. So the last thing I'll do is I will plug a garbage cube service in here. So we've got real garbage trucks leaving from this area. And you may have also noticed that I moved it away from our village by about 400 in-game meters as well. It was just far too close, I think. We're going to finish off this sort of block here between the church and the rubbish dump here with just a few paddocks back towards town. As tempting as it was to fill this entire block in with more buildings, there's got to be a point where we transition this towards paddocks, and I just felt like this might be a good area to start doing that. We have got one more episode after this in the UK where we're going to put some more modern style row houses in and really finish off this village to get some nice shots of it. Then we're going to contemplate moving on to the next place. I haven't thought about where we're going yet or anything. Still waiting to hear from you guys, but that's the plan. After building in the UK for a number of weeks now, I'm finally starting to get the vibe that I was after. Those beautiful green rolling hills, breathtaking old castles, and as of this episode, a beautiful old church and cemetery that's actually servicing our town as well. I really enjoy taking you guys on this journey, and I hope you enjoy it as well. I'll see yous in the next one. Peace.